My parents banned me from my own sister's wedding after I paid for it, and 3 days later, they called begging me to cover the bill. I was standing outside a glass pavilion in the Blue Ridge Mountains, close enough to hear the string quartet playing through the walls, close enough to smell the white roses and gardenias arranged along the island side. The October light was soft and golden, the kind of afternoon that makes everything look like it belongs in a painting. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see my younger sister in her wedding dress standing in a hallway made entirely of glass. She looked like she had stepped out of every dream she had ever described to me since we were children. And then she saw me. Our eyes met through the glass, and for 1 second I thought she would come to the door or call my name, or at least raise her hand. She did not look surprised to see me standing outside. She looked afraid, and then without a word, she turned her back and walked toward the ceremony. That was the moment I understood that she already knew I would not be allowed in. My name is Clara Mitchell. I am 34 years old, and I work as a senior compliance analyst for a hospital system in Portland, Oregon. I spend my days reviewing policies, identifying risks, and making sure the people in charge follow the rules they agreed to. I am trained to read contracts carefully to catch inconsistencies, and to never ignore a red flag. But when it came to my own family, I ignored every single one. 5 months before that afternoon at the Glass Pavilion, I had signed a third-party payment authorization and paid a $4,200 deposit to secure my sister's wedding venue, catering, flowers, and photography. My parents had promised they would handle the remaining $38,000. Instead, they used my money to book everything, told the groom's wealthy family that they were funding the celebration themselves. And then on the day of the wedding, my mother stepped in front of the entrance and told me that only family was allowed inside. When the groom's mother walked over and asked who I was, my mother smiled and said I was someone from the wedding planner's billing department who had arrived at the wrong time. My father stood beside her and did not correct a single word. 3 days later, my mother finally called me. She did not ask whether I had made it home safely. She did not mention the 18-hour flight I'd taken to be there. Her first words were about the invoice. "The remaining balance is $38,000. She said, "How are you going to pay it?" I laughed and I gave her an answer that made her go completely silent. "Before I tell you what I said, tell me something. Where are you watching from right now, and what is the weather like where you are? I'm curious to see how far this story travels. And does the weather outside match your mood today? Because this story is about family, about money, about silence, and about the moment you finally stop paying for a seat at a table where you were never truly welcome. If you had ever loved someone who only remembered your name when they needed something from you, this story will feel familiar. Please like and subscribe to True Stories, the Tragedies and Comedies of Life, so you do not miss what happens next. Now let me take you back 5 months to a FaceTime call on a Tuesday evening that changed everything. It was a Tuesday evening in late May, and I had just come home from a long shift at the hospital system where I work. I was sitting on my couch in my apartment in Portland, still in my work clothes, reviewing a compliance report on my laptop, when my phone lit up with a FaceTime call from my younger sister Sophie. She was 26 years old, 7 years younger than me, and the moment I answered, she held her left hand so close to the camera that the diamond ring blurred into a bright smear of light. She was screaming and laughing at the same time, and through the blur, I could hear her saying that Ethan Calloway had proposed during a weekend getaway in the Blue Ridge Mountains. She described standing on a trail overlooking the valley at sunset, the October leaves turning every shade of red and gold around them, and how Ethan had gotten down on one knee right there on the ridge with the mountain stretching out behind him. I was genuinely happy for her. Sophie had dreamed about her wedding since we were little girls, and Ethan seemed like a good man. He worked in operations management for his family's mountain resort company, and he treated her with a steadiness that made me feel like she had chosen well. While Sophie talked about dresses and flower arrangements, and how she wanted the ceremony to feel like something out of a movie, I noticed our mother Diane moving around in the background. She was rearranging something on the kitchen counter, but I could tell she was listening to every word. When I told Sophie I would start looking at flights and request time off from work, Mom leaned into the frame with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, and told me not to make plans just yet. She said the wedding would probably be small, and that flying all the way from Oregon was expensive and unnecessary. I reminded her that Sophie was my only sister, and that I would not miss it for anything. Mom forced a wider smile and said the guest count was not finalized, and then Sophie quickly changed the subject and started describing the glass pavilion overlooking a lake, where she wanted to get married. But even after the call ended, Mom's reaction stayed with me. She had not sounded worried about the cost of my plane ticket. She had sounded worried that I might actually show up. That night, lying in bed, I thought about something I had not remembered in years. When Sophie and I were little, we used to play wedding in our backyard. Sophie would drape our mother's white tablecloth over her head like a veil and walk slowly between 2 rows of lawn chairs, holding a bunch of dandelions she had picked from the edge of the driveway. I was always the audience. I would sit in one of the chairs and clap when she reached the end of the aisle, and she would turn around and bow, and we would both laugh until our stomachs hurt. Even then, even in a game, I was the one watching from the outside, while she walked towards something beautiful. I did not know at the time that this childhood scene would repeat itself in the most painful way imaginable decades later, on a real wedding day. About a week after the engagement call, Mom and Dad called me together. When both of them got on the phone at the same time, it almost always meant they were going to ask me for something, and that something was usually money. My father, Richard, owned a custom cabinetry shop in a small town in the Appalachian foothills. He built kitchen cabinets, bathroom vanities, and built-in shelving for vacation homes and mountain lodges, all by hand, all made to order. His craftsmanship was beautiful, the kind of work that people used to wait months for, but the business had been struggling for a long time. A major piece of equipment had broken down and needed replacing. Clients were paying late or renegotiating contracts after the work was already finished, and the bank had reduced his line of credit twice in the past year. Like so many small business owners in rural America, my father was caught between rising costs and shrinking demand, and his pride made it almost impossible for him to admit how bad things had gotten. Mom started the conversation by reminding me how much Sophie admired me, and how much it would mean to have the whole family pulling together for this wedding. Dad explained that the venue and vendors required immediate deposits to hold the date, and that Ethan's family, the Callaways, had agreed to cover the rehearsal, dinner, transportation, and the honeymoon. Our family's responsibility was the ceremony and the reception. Dad called the problem temporary cash flow, and Mom described what they needed as a reliable third party to secure everything until the business picked up. I asked for the total amount, and after a pause that lasted a little too long, Dad said $42,200. Mom quickly added that I would only need to pay the $4,200 deposit up front and sign a payment authorization, allowing the vendors to request my approval for the remaining $38,000 after the wedding. She promised with absolute certainty that they would handle the balance themselves. I asked why Ethan's family could not put one of their cards down instead, and Mom became defensive. She said the Callaways were already paying more than their share, and that it was important for our family to show that we could honor our commitments. Then Dad mentioned something that shifted the entire conversation. He told me that the Callaway Resort Company was planning to renovate several rental cabins and lodges across their properties, and that his shop was being considered for the cabinetry contract. He said it could be worth several $100,000 over the next few years, enough to save the business and pay off everything he owed. Suddenly, this wedding was not just about Sophie. It was about Dad's business survival, Mom's reputation in their small community, and a contract they desperately needed to land. They could not afford to look financially unstable in front of the Callaways, and my credit card was the tool that would make their family appear solid and dependable. I should have said no. I had already covered a property tax shortage for my parents 2 years earlier. I had paid for a semester of Sophie's tuition when she switched design programs. I had sent money for replacement equipment when Dad's main sub broke down. Every time they thanked me warmly, and every time the gratitude lasted exactly as long as it took for the check to clear. But I told myself that this was different, that Sophie should not lose her dream venue because I was tired of being the one who always stepped up. So I agreed to review the contracts, because in my line of work I read every line of every document before I signed anything. The event hosts listed on the venue, catering, florist, and photography agreements were Richard Mitchell, Diane Mitchell, Sophie Mitchell, and Ethan Callaway. My name appeared only on a separate third-party payment authorization. It allowed me to pay the deposit and stated that the vendors could request my written approval before charging the final balance. If I declined, the financial responsibility would remain entirely with the event hosts. I highlighted that section, saved a copy for my records, and emailed it to my parents. Mom replied almost immediately and said it was standard language that would never matter. I signed the authorization and paid the $4,200 deposit. Mom called me her lifesaver. Sophie sent me a string of heart emojis and wrote, "You are the best sister anyone could ever ask for." Those words felt good for about 48 hours. 2 days later, Sophie created a group chat for wedding planning. I learned about it only because she accidentally sent me a screenshot of a conversation I had not been included in. When I asked about it, she said the chat was for people who lived nearby, and that the time zone difference between Oregon and the East Coast made it inconvenient to include me. A month passed and I still had not received a wedding invitation. When I brought it up, Sophie laughed and said immediate family did not need formal invitations. Then Mom asked me not to post anything about the wedding on social media because the Callaways valued their privacy. This would have made sense if Sophie herself had not been posting dress fittings, cake tastings, and venue tours almost every day, and whenever the Callaways appeared in those posts, my parents acted as though they were funding the entire celebration. Mom wrote on one post that she and Dad were giving their daughter the wedding of her dreams. They'd commented that years of hard work had made this moment possible. Neither of them mentioned me, not once. I told myself that I did not need recognition, that helping my family was reward enough. But somewhere deeper in the part of my brain that reviews documents for a living and flags anything that does not add up. I knew something was wrong. In my career I have never once ignored an inconsistency in a contract or a report, but with my own family I ignored every single one. 2 weeks before the wedding I still had not received an invitation, a schedule, or any details about what was expected of me beyond showing up. When I called Sophie and asked directly whether she had my mailing address for the invitation, she laughed as if I had said something silly and told me that immediate family did not need a formal invitation. She said I was automatically included because I was her sister, and she told me to wear navy or dark green, and that the ceremony would begin at 2 in the afternoon. When I asked about the rehearsal dinner, she paused for just a moment, and then said there was a small gathering for the wedding party and close local family. The phrase did not make sense to me because I was her only sister and the person who had paid the deposit that made the entire event possible, but I let it go. I told myself she was busy and overwhelmed, and that I was reading too much into things. I requested 5 days of leave from work, which was not easy to arrange during our annual compliance review cycle, and I booked a flight from Portland through Los Angeles, and then through Atlanta before finally landing in Nashville. With layovers, gate changes, and the usual delays, the trip would take close to 18 hours. I reserved a rental car and a hotel room near the venue, and I spent an evening carefully wrapping a set of leather luggage I had chosen for Sophie and Ethan's honeymoon. I remember running my hands over the stitching and thinking about how surprised she would be when she opened it. 3 days before my flight, I was scrolling through my phone during the lunch break when I saw Sophie's latest post. It was a series of photographs from the rehearsal dinner, which had apparently already taken place. She was standing between our mother and Margaret Calloway, Ethan's mother, beneath a banner that read, "Two families becoming one." The caption said, "Surrounded by everyone who carried us to this moment." I stared at that word "everyone" for a long time. I'd carried more than anyone in that photograph, and I was not in it. I texted Sophie and asked why I had not been told about the dinner. 4 hours later, she replied that it had turned into a last-minute thing, and there had not been time to let me know. The excuse made no difference anyway, since I was still in Oregon and could not have attended even if she had called, but the pattern was becoming harder to ignore. I was welcome to pay but not to participate. The night before I left Portland, Mom called with one more instruction. She told me not to come to their house after I landed. She said the rooms were full of decorations and everyone would be exhausted from the rehearsal. She told me to go straight to the venue and arrive close to the ceremony time, because there was no reason to come early. Asked if Sophie needed help getting ready in the morning the way sisters do before a wedding, helping with her hair, adjusting her veil, sharing a quiet moment before everything becomes a blur. Mom answered too quickly. She said the bridal suite was small and already crowded with the bridesmaids, and that I would just be in the way. During the flight somewhere over the Rocky Mountains with the sun setting outside my window, I'd opened my phone and wrote a short toast. I wrote about how Sophie used to play wedding in our backyard when she was 8 years old, how she would drape our mother's white tablecloth over her head and walk between rows of lawn chairs holding a fistful of dandelions, and how I would always sit in the front chair and clap for her when she reached the end of the aisle. I wrote about how proud I was that the little girl with the dandelion bouquet had grown into a woman who found someone worthy of standing beside her. I read it quietly to myself as the plane flew over the Great Plains, and I smiled. I still believed completely that I would stand up at the reception and deliver those words in front of our family. After landing in Asheville, I texted Mom, Dad, and Sophie to let them know I had arrived safely. Dad did not respond. Sophie sent a thumbs-up emoji. Mom replied nearly an hour later with 3 words. Ceremony at 2. No one asked about the flight or whether I was hungry or if I wanted to meet for breakfast the next morning. At the hotel, I called Sophie, but she let it go to voicemail. I left a message telling her I loved her and that I could not wait to see her walk down the aisle. She never called back. The next afternoon, I drove to the venue with my gift on the passenger seat wrapped in silver paper with a white ribbon. The glass pavilion sat at the edge of a lake surrounded by trees that had turned every shade of amber and crimson, and the Blue Ridge Mountains rose behind it like a painting that someone had placed there just for this day. I arrived 20 minutes early, feeling nervous and excited the way you do before something you have been looking forward to for months. At the check-in table near the entrance, the attendant searched the printed guest list and then checked a tablet, and then searched the list again. She looked up at me with an apologetic expression and asked whether I might be listed under a different name. I told her I was the bride. Her smile disappeared, and she quietly contacted someone through her earpiece. My parents appeared less than 2 minutes later. Mom was wearing a silver blue dress with her hair pinned up, and Dad was in a dark suit with a pale tie. Neither of them was smiling. Mom walked directly toward me and stopped close enough that only I could hear her. She asked me what I was doing there, and I almost laughed, because the question seemed so absurd. I told her I was there for Sophie's wedding. She glanced over her shoulder toward the guests, who were already seated inside, and then she lowered her voice and said the words that I will never forget. Only family is allowed inside, she said. You were not invited. Please leave before you embarrass your sister." I looked at my father, waiting for him to step in, waiting for him to say something that would make this make sense. Instead, he looked at the ground and told me that I should have understood the situation, and that coming here was only going to make things harder for everyone. I felt my chest tighten, and I heard myself ask, "Was I family when you needed my credit card?" Mom told me to lower my voice. At that moment, Margaret Calloway walked over in an elegant cream-colored dress. She was poised and warm, the kind of woman who notices when something is wrong and walks toward it instead of away from it. She looked at me and asked if everything was all right. For 1 second, I waited for my mother to introduce me, to say, "This is Clara, our oldest daughter. She flew all the way from Portland to be here." Instead, Mom smiled brightly and said that I was connected to the wedding planner's billing department and had arrived at the wrong time to discuss an invoice. Margaret looked confused and said she thought all the finances had been settled. Mom laughed nervously and called it a minor administrative mix-up. My father stood beside her and did not say a single word to correct the lie. I could have told Margaret everything right there. I could have said that I was their eldest daughter, that I had traveled nearly 18 hours, that the deposit securing this entire wedding had come from my bank account, and that the woman standing in front of her had just denied I was part of the family. But then I looked past them through the glass hallway that connected the entrance to the ceremony space, and I saw Sophie. She was standing alone for a moment, in her wedding dress, white lace catching the afternoon light, and she was looking directly at me. Our eyes met through the glass. She did not look surprised. She did not look confused. She looked frightened, the way someone looks when the thing they hoped would not happen is happening right in front of them. But she did not open the door. She did not call my name. She did not take a single step toward me. She turned her back and walked away. That was the moment I understood. She had known. She had known all along. I told my parents quietly that I had heard their decision. Then I turned and walked back to the rental car, carrying the gift I had wrapped with so much care. Behind me, I heard Mom call out not to be so dramatic. I placed the gift in the trunk and sat behind the steering wheel, and for several minutes I could not start the engine. I just sat there in the parking lot, watching the last guests walk inside, listening to the faint sound of music beginning through the walls of the pavilion. I had spent my whole life believing that if I kept showing up, kept solving problems, kept writing checks without being asked twice, they would eventually see me as someone who belonged. Instead, they took my money and erased me from the picture. I picked up my phone and deleted the toast I had written on the plane. Then something shifted inside me, and the part of my brain that I use every day at work took over. I recorded the exact time, the location, the words my mother had said, the names of the people present, and I emailed everything to myself so that there would be a clear timestamp. I did not know yet what I would do with those notes, but I knew that accuracy mattered, and I knew that feelings fade, but documentation does not. As the ceremony music swelled inside the pavilion, a notification appeared on my phone. It was from the venue's payment system. "Final payment reconciliation available," it said. "Authorization required by Monday at noon." Total was $38,000. At the bottom of the screen there were two options: approve payment or decline authorization. I drove back to the hotel with the gift still in the trunk and the sound of wedding music still echoing somewhere in the back of my mind. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while, staring at the wall, feeling the kind of emptiness that comes after something you trusted completely falls apart in front of you. But I did not let myself stay in that place for long, because I have learned through years of professional training and personal experience that the worst decisions are made in the first hour of pain. I did not want anger to make this choice for me. I wanted the documents to tell me what I had the right to do. I opened my laptop, logged into my email, and downloaded every contract and agreement related to Sophie's wedding. I spread them across the screen the same way I would spread compliance files across my desk at the hospital, carefully, methodically looking for the facts and nothing else. The venue contract, the catering agreement, the florist invoice, and the photography package all listed the same four names as event hosts: Richard Mitchell, Diane Mitchell, Sophie Mitchell, and Ethan Calloway. My name did not appear on any of those documents as a host or responsible party. It appeared only on the separate third-party payment authorization, which stated clearly that I had paid a non-refundable deposit of $4,200 and had agreed that the vendors could request my written approval before processing the final balance. The critical language was right there, the same language I had highlighted months ago and emailed to my parents, the same language my mother had dismissed as standard wording. It would never matter. If I declined authorization, no payment would be processed from my account, and the remaining balance would become the full responsibility of the event hosts. I was not canceling any services. I was not asking any vendor to absorb a loss. I was simply refusing to volunteer $38,000 of my own money for a celebration I had been physically barred from attending. I picked up the phone and called each vendor one by one. I confirmed with the venue, the caterer, the florist, and the photographer that declining my authorization would redirect the balance to the hosts listed on the contracts. Every vendor confirmed that this was correct, and that the host would have 5 business days to arrange payment or set up a payment plan. I requested written confirmation from each of them, and I saved every email alongside the original contract in a folder on my laptop. Then one by one, I opened each invoice on the payment portal. The venue was $16,000. The caterer was $12,500. The florist was $5,700. The photographer was $3,800. On each invoice, I clicked Decline Authorization, and in the notes field I wrote that I had not attended the event, had not received the contracted services, and would not be providing voluntary payment. I did not mention the argument at the entrance. I did not insult anyone. I did not explain what my mother had said, or what my father had failed to say. I kept it clean, factual, and professional because I knew from my career that emotion weakens documentation and clarity protects it. When I was finished, I closed my laptop and sat quietly for a moment. Then I walked to the closet, took Sophie's gift out of the garment bag, where I had placed it, and put it in my suitcase. I had thought about mailing it to her after I got home, but mailing the gift would have been another way of pretending that nothing had happened, another way of smoothing things over and absorbing the cost of being treated as though I did not exist. The gift stayed in my suitcase, and it came home with me. That evening around 9, my phone rang. It was my Aunt Vivian, my father's older sister, a retired mediation attorney who had spent 30 years helping people navigate conflicts with calm and precision. She had attended the wedding and noticed that I was not there. She told me that during the reception, Mom had stood up and given a speech about how she and Dad had sacrificed for years to provide Sophie with the perfect celebration. She described Mom's voice breaking with emotion as she talked about all the hard work and planning that had gone into making this day possible. Then Dad had stood up and thanked the Callaways for welcoming the Mitchell family and for trusting them with this partnership between two families. Aunt Vivian said she had sat there listening, knowing that the shop was struggling, knowing that my parents did not have the kind of money that speech implied, and feeling more and more confused about where the funding had actually come from. When I told her what had happened at the entrance, she went quiet for a long moment. Then she asked 2 very specific questions, the kind of questions only a lawyer would think to ask in that moment. She asked whose names were on the contracts, and she asked whether my payment authorization required my final approval before any charge could go through. When I confirmed both, she said something that settled every nerve in my body. She said, do exactly what the documents allow. Keep your records, and let the adults who signed those contracts remain responsible for what they agreed to. Then she added, calmness does not have to mean surrender. That sentence stayed with me through everything that followed. I changed my flight to Monday morning. Before leaving the hotel, I took one last look at the venue from the parking lot. The pavilion was dark now, the chairs were being folded, and a cleaning crew was carrying out trash bags full of flowers that had already started to wilt. On Sunday morning, the 4 invoices arrived in my email with the final amounts due. I had already declined each one, and the confirmations were saved. I drove to the airport feeling something I had not expected to feel. It was not anger and it was not sadness. It was relief. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I was not carrying someone else's emergency on my shoulders. During the flight home, I slept for several hours and woke somewhere over the Pacific Northwest, the sunlight filling the window, and a stillness inside me that felt completely unfamiliar. No one had called to ask whether I had traveled safely. No one had texted to check on me, but I knew exactly when they would remember I existed, because the invoices would be redirected to the event hosts by Tuesday morning. Mom called at 9:14 on Tuesday morning, 3 days after the wedding. Her voice was soft and warm, the kind of voice she used when she wanted something. She asked whether I had arrived home safely and said she hoped I had gotten some rest. It was the first time anyone in my immediate family had asked about my trip, and it came 72 hours too late. She said that weddings were emotional, and that the incident at the entrance had been an unfortunate misunderstanding. I asked her which part she had misunderstood, whether it was the part where she forgot I was her daughter, or the part where she told a stranger I worked in billing. Her warmth disappeared instantly. She said this was not the time to reopen the argument, and then she got to the real reason for the call. The vendors had contacted her. My authorization had been declined, and the full remaining balance of $38,000 had been transferred to the event hosts. How are you going to pay it? She asked, as if the money still belonged to her after she had told me I did not belong to the family. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because she sounded genuinely confused, as though she truly believed that being denied at the door would not change anything about the financial arrangement. And then I gave her the answer that I had been carrying inside me since the moment she blocked my path at the entrance. You said only family was allowed inside, Mom, I said. So the family that was inside can pay for it. The line went completely silent. I could hear her breathing, and I could feel her trying to find the words that would turn this back around in her favor. Then she called me childish and accused me of creating a financial crisis over what she described as one uncomfortable conversation. I reminded her that she had not introduced me as her daughter in front of Margaret Calloway. She said she was trying to prevent a scene because the Callaways had been given a simplified explanation about our family. I asked what that meant, and after a pause, she admitted that she had told them I had been estranged from the family for years and had refused to participate in the wedding. I asked her why she would say something that was completely untrue, and she said the Callaways valued close, stable families, and that Dad needed their business, and that she did not want complications damaging Sophie's future with Ethan. She wanted my money, but she could not have my presence because my existence contradicted the story she had sold. 20 minutes after Mom hung up, Sophie called. She was already crying. Ethan had received the redirected invoices and wanted to know why my payment had been withdrawn. She told me he was furious because he had believed all along that our parents were paying for the ceremony and reception. He had never known that I provided the deposit, and he had no idea I was expected to cover the final balance. Sophie begged me to approve the payment before Ethan's parents found out the truth. I asked her whether she knew Mom had planned to keep me outside. She said Mom had told her it would be easier if I did not enter the venue, but she claimed she did not know Dad would actually speak to me that way. I reminded her that she saw me through the glass hallway and turned away without saying a word. She said she was moments away from walking down the aisle and did not know what to do. I told her she made a choice, and she chose the ceremony, the image, and the money over her own sis. Then, even in the middle of her tears and her apology, she asked whether I could at least pay half. Even while she was telling me she was sorry, she was calculating how much money she could still recover from me. I told her that I would be willing to talk about our relationship whenever she was ready to have a conversation that did not include an invoice. She did not know what to say to that. Dad called later that afternoon. His voice sounded tired, and he told me the vendors were demanding a payment plan and that the stress was affecting him physically. I asked him why he signed contracts he could not afford. He said he believed I understood what family responsibility meant. I asked him whether family responsibility included standing in silence while Mom told a stranger I was a billing employee. After a long pause, he admitted that the Callaway Resort contract could have been worth several $100,000 over the next few years, and that Mom had been terrified that revealing any family conflict would make the Mitchells look unreliable and cost him the opportunity. I told him that hiding his daughter and lying about who paid for the wedding was what made him unreliable. He said I was letting his business collapse to prove a point. I asked him whether he had ever planned to repay the $38,000, and he said the resort contract would have eventually provided enough income to cover it. That was when I fully understood what they had expected. They had planned for me to carry the debt quietly and indefinitely until Dad could benefit from the lie he had built on my money. That evening they sat down at my laptop and composed one email. I sent it to Mom, Dad, Sophie, and Ethan. I attached every contract, every payment confirmation, and every written response from the vendors showing that the event hosts were financially responsible. I stated clearly that I would not authorize any payment, and I requested that all future communication about finances be conducted in writing. At the end of the email I wrote one sentence about what I needed before any personal relationship could move forward. I said that any future connection with me would require a specific, honest acknowledgement of what happened at the venue without excuses, without guilt, and without a request for money. That email changed everything, but not in the way I expected, because the truth, once it starts moving, does not stop at the people you send it to. It reaches everyone. About an hour after I sent that email, my phone rang. It was Aunt Vivian. She told me that Margaret Callaway had contacted her directly. Margaret had somehow gotten Vivian's number through a mutual acquaintance in town, and she had called with a very specific question. She wanted to know who the woman standing outside the venue really was. Apparently the financial story my parents had constructed was already beginning to unravel. Ethan had confronted Sophie about the invoices, and the numbers did not match what his family had been told. Margaret was not the kind of woman who let inconsistencies go unanswered, and she had started asking questions that no one in my family was prepared to answer. Aunt Vivian called me before she responded to Margaret because she wanted my permission to share the truth. I told her she could tell Margaret everything, but nothing exaggerated and nothing invented, just the facts. So Vivian told her. She explained that I was Richard and Diane Mitchell's eldest daughter, that I lived in Portland, Oregon, and that I had traveled nearly 18 hours to attend the wedding. She told her that I had paid the $4,200 deposit that secured the venue, the catering, the flowers, and the photography, and that my parents had expected me to approve another $38,000 after the reception. Then she told her what happened at the entrance, that my mother had stopped me from going inside, told me I was not invited, and when Margaret herself had walked over and asked who I was, my mother had introduced me as someone from the wedding planner's billing department. Margaret asked Vivian several times why my parents would do something like that. Vivian said she would have to ask them directly, and she added only one personal observation. She said that I had shown more restraint by walking away quietly than most people would have shown in the same situation. What happened next I learned from Ethan weeks later when he and I finally spoke directly. Margaret requested a meeting with my parents, Sophie, Ethan, and her husband David. She organized it at the Calloway family home, and she placed the contracts and the invoices on the dining room table before anyone sat down. She asked my mother a simple question. She asked who had paid the deposit. Mom tried to say the money had come from the family collectively, using a vague phrase that could mean anything. Ethan corrected her immediately. He said the payment receipt listed my credit card, and he had already verified it with the venue. Margaret then turned to my father and asked why he had told their family that his business savings were covering the cost of the reception. Dad admitted that he had expected to reimburse me after securing new contracts. Margaret asked whether he was referring to the cabin renovation contract from their resort company. He said yes. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said something that closed a door my father had been counting on for months. She said that their company could not award a major contract to someone who began a professional relationship with false financial information. Dad tried to argue that his craftsmanship had nothing to do with a private family dispute, but Margaret was firm. She said that honesty and financial reliability were not separate from business, and that they could not be treated as private matters when evaluating a contractor. His shop was removed from consideration that afternoon. Mom immediately blamed me for refusing to cooperate. Margaret asked how I could possibly cooperate with a wedding I had been forbidden to attend. Mom repeated the story she had told before, that I had been estranged from the family for years. But this time Sophie spoke. She admitted quietly and with difficulty that I had never been estranged, that I had continued helping the family financially throughout her entire adult life, and that I had helped pay for part of her education. Ethan turned to her and asked why she had never told him any of this. Sophie said she was ashamed of how dependent they had all become on me. He asked her why the solution was to take more of my money while pretending I did not exist, and she had no answer for that. Margaret made it clear that the Calloways would not pay the $38,000 balance. They had already covered their agreed share of the wedding expenses, including the rehearsal dinner, the transportation, and the honeymoon, and she said that paying the Mitchell family's portion would be rewarding the deception rather than correcting it. Ethan supported his mother's decision completely, and what followed was the beginning of a very difficult season for everyone who had signed those contracts. Sophie and Ethan cancelled their honeymoon. They used the travel refunds and a large portion of their wedding gift money to make the first round of vendor payments. For the remaining balance, they took out a personal loan, and Ethan insisted that it remain in both of their names because both of them had signed the contracts as event hosts. Sophie increased her hours at the design studio, where she worked part-time, and eventually accepted a full-time position to help manage the payments. Ethan also required that they begin financial counseling together, because he told her he could no longer trust her to disclose important information about money, and he did not want to build a marriage on a foundation where critical facts were hidden from him. They stayed married, but the effortless beginning that Sophie had imagined, the honeymoon photographs, the carefree first months of newlywed life, none of that happened. Instead, their marriage started with alone a counselor and a conversation about trust that most couples do not have until years into a relationship. Dad faced his own consequences. Without the Calloway Resort contract, the future income he had been counting on to save his business simply vanished. He could no longer tell himself or his employees that a big opportunity was just around the corner. He sold an old fishing boat that he had kept docked at a lake nearby, a boat he had owned for 15 years, and always said he would take out more often when things slowed down. He used the money from the sale to make the first large vendor payment. He delayed purchasing new equipment for the shop and negotiated a structured payment plan with the remaining vendors. He also had to sit down with his 2 employees and admit that the business had expanded too quickly based on income that was never guaranteed, and that the months ahead would be tight. It was the first time I had ever known my father to speak honestly about the shop's finances to anyone outside the family. Mom's consequences were different from everyone else's because they were not financial. They were social. For years she had carefully built an identity in their small community around charity events, church fundraisers, and being known as a devoted mother who gave everything for her children. She and Margaret Calloway had served together on the annual fundraising gala committee for the local hospital. After learning the truth about the wedding, Margaret withdrew from their joint role on the committee. She told the other members that she could no longer co-manage charitable donations alongside someone whose financial claims she no longer trusted. Margaret did not reveal every detail of what had happened, but in a small town like theirs, questions had a way of finding answers on their own. People who had attended the wedding began asking why I had not been there. Mom told them it was a misunderstanding involving an estranged daughter, but relatives who knew better, including Aunt Vivian, confirmed that I had never stopped helping the family. Vivian refused to cover for her. When Mom accused Vivian of destroying the family's reputation, Vivian replied that she had only stopped protecting a lie. Within a month, Mom quietly resigned from the committee. She was not publicly humiliated or run out of town, but the version of herself that she had presented to the world for years, the generous mother, the capable organizer, the woman who had it all together, the version no longer controlled the room. People smiled at her the same way but they no longer took every word she said at face value. 2 weeks after the wedding, Sophie sent me a long message. She apologized for the cancelled honeymoon, for Ethan's anger, and for the loan they had been forced to take out. Then at the end of the message she asked whether I could cover just one monthly payment until her salary increased. I read the message twice because even after everything that had happened she was still apologizing for the consequences rather than for what she had done to me. She was sorry the honeymoon was cancelled. She was sorry Ethan was upset. She was sorry there was a loan. But she had not yet said she was sorry for standing on the other side of the glass and turning her back while our mother told me I was not family. I told her I would not make any payments, and that I would be ready to listen whenever she was ready to talk about her choices at the venue without mentioning money. A month later, Dad sent me an email. The subject line said no excuse. It was short, and it was the most honest thing he had ever written to me. He admitted that he knew Mum had planned to keep me outside the venue, and that he had agreed to it because he was afraid of losing the Callaway contract. He wrote that he had chosen a possible business opportunity over his own daughter, and that there was no justification for it. He said he would repay my $4,200 deposit in 12 monthly payments of $350, and he did not ask for forgiveness or mention his situation. The next morning, $350 appeared in my bank account with the memo payment 1 of 12. It did not repair the relationship, and it did not undo the moment at the entrance. But it was the first apology from anyone in my family that came with responsibility attached to it instead of another request. Mom also reached out around the same time. She sent me a message saying she was sorry that everything had been misunderstood, and then she asked me to contact Margaret Callaway and explain that the wedding dispute had nothing to do with Dad's business. She wanted my forgiveness, but only because she needed it to restore what she had lost. She was not sorry for what she did. She was sorry that it had stopped working. I did not reply. But the story does not end with money or consequences. The thing that truly changed my life began on a quiet afternoon in a therapist's office when she used a phrase I had never heard before. 6 months after the wedding, my life in Portland looked ordinary from the outside. I still worked at the same hospital system, still reviewed policies and compliance reports, still showed up early and stayed late. But something inside me had shifted in a way that I could not ignore, and for the first time in my adult life, I made a decision that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs. I started therapy. I had always thought therapy was for people who could not handle their problems, and I had spent my entire life proving that I could handle anything. But sitting across from my therapist in her small office on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, I realized that handling everything was the problem, not the proof that I was fine. She listened to me describe the wedding, the deposit, the phone calls, the years of covering shortfalls and absorbing emergencies, and then she said something I had never heard before. She called it functional over-responsibility. She explained that I had built my entire identity around being useful, that I measured my worth not by how I felt or what I needed, but by how many problems I could solve for other people. When my family had a crisis, I believed that love required me to fix it. When they ignored me afterward, I did not pull back. I tried harder. When they needed money, I treated my savings account as a shared resource that they were entitled to access whenever the situation felt urgent enough. And the situation always felt urgent enough because urgency was the only language my family used when they spoke to me. My therapist also introduced me to a pattern that researchers have been discussing more openly in recent years, something often called the eldest daughter effect. It is not a clinical diagnosis, but it describes a recognizable experience that millions of women share. The eldest daughter in a family often carries a disproportionate amount of emotional, financial, and organizational responsibilities that begin in childhood and continue well into adulthood long after they stop being appropriate. She described it in a way that felt like she was reading a page from my own life. She said it looks like a woman who manages everything, but never rests, who cannot receive care without looking for the hidden cost behind it, who is always the most competent person in the room, and also the loneliest. I sat in that chair and felt something crack open inside me, not in a painful way, but in the way a window cracks open after being sealed shut for too long. Suddenly there was air where there had not been air before. Therapy did not teach me to hate my family. It taught me to separate compassion from obligation. I could care about my father without financing his business. I could love Sophie without shielding her from the consequences of her own choices. I could understand my mother's fear of being judged without allowing that fear to decide whether I was part of the family. These were not punishments. They were the boundaries I should have built years ago, before the deposit, before the contracts, before the glass pavilion. I created 4 financial rules for myself, and I wrote them down on a note card that I kept in my desk drawer at work. First, I would never cost any loan for a family member. Second, any money I gave would be clearly identified as either a gift with no expectation of return or a documented loan with agreed terms. Third, I would never provide a credit card for an event or commitment that I did not personally control. And fourth, before agreeing to any major financial request, I would wait at least 72 hours before giving an answer, because I had learned that guilt moves fast, But wisdom needs time. Those rules were not revenge. They were a structure that gave me space to think before emotion answered for me. I also started sharing some of what I had learned during financial wellness workshops at my workplace. I never used my family's names or told the full story, but I explained how third-party payment authorizations work, what legal responsibility looks like when your name is not on a contract, and why written records matter more than verbal promises. Several coworkers came to me afterward and said they had been reconsidering co-signing loans for relatives or lending credit cards to family members for large expenses. Turning my humiliation into useful knowledge gave the experience a meaning that went beyond my own pain. It did not erase what happened, but it made the lesson worth something to someone other than me. Outside of work, I stopped spending my free weekends waiting for the next family emergency. I joined a trail running group that met every Saturday morning in Forest Park, and I started volunteering at a community garden near my apartment. I returned Sophie's wedding gift and used part of the refund to buy hiking boots and a good rain jacket. I spent time with friends who invited me because they wanted my company, not because they needed my credit limit. For the first time in years, my phone did not make me anxious when it rang. Dad continued sending $350 every month, and he never missed a single payment. His emails became more honest as the months went on. He told me when the shop lost a client without asking me to replace the income. He mentioned that he had started working with a small business advisor through a local community program. After the 6th payment, he wrote something that stopped me in the middle of reading. He said that he finally understood how often he had treated my competence as permission to place more weight on my shoulders, and that he was ashamed it had taken losing a contract and nearly losing his daughter to see it clearly. I did not forgive him immediately because I had learned that consistency matters more than one well-written sentence. But I began answering some of his emails. The door between us was not open, but it was no longer sealed shut. Sophie contacted me nearly 5 months after the wedding. Her message was shorter than the first one she had sent, and it was completely different in tone. She did not mention the loan, or the cancelled honeymoon, or Ethan's frustration. Instead, she admitted that she knew Mom had planned to keep me outside the venue, and that she had stayed silent because she was afraid of losing the wedding and the Callaways' approval. She acknowledged that she saw me through the glass hallway and turned away. She said she had allowed me to fund a celebration where I was never meant to be welcomed. There was no request for money, no blame shifted to anyone else, and no demand that I speak to Ethan or Margaret on her behalf. She wrote that she understood if I never trusted her again. That was the first apology from anyone in my family that named the actual wound instead of dancing around it. I agreed to one phone call. I told her that rebuilding our relationship would take time, honesty, and absolutely no financial dependence. She accepted. We now speak for about 30 minutes once a month. The conversations are sometimes uncomfortable, and sometimes we sit in silence for long stretches, but at least we are no longer pretending. Sophie and Ethan are still married. They continue counseling, and they are still paying off the loan. Their marriage began with a crack, but cracks can also show you where reinforcement is needed. Whether they succeed will depend on what they build from the truth, not on how beautiful their wedding photographs looked. Mom has not offered a real apology. She still refers to the wedding as a misunderstanding and tells relatives that I overreacted. The difference now is that I no longer chase her approval or argue with her version of events. I sent her one final email, in which I said I would consider limited contact only after she acknowledged 3 specific facts. She told the Callaways I was estranged when I was not. She accepted my money while planning to exclude me, and she denied my identity to a stranger to protect her own image. Until she could state those 3 things without changing the subject or blaming someone else, I would not resume the relationship. She never replied, and I have made peace with that silence. It no longer belongs to her. It belongs to me. I used to believe that a boundary had failed if the other person refused to understand it. Now I know that understanding is not required. A boundary is not an argument you have to win. It is information about what you will allow and what will happen when that limit is crossed. That was the most valuable thing the wedding taught me. Family love should never require one person to become the permanent provider, the rescuer, the mediator, and the silent witness all at once. Helping someone can be generous, but repeatedly shielding people from the consequences of their own choices may prevent them from ever becoming responsible. A real apology must name the behavior, recognize the harm, and include an effort to repair it. Dad's monthly payments did not erase what happened, but they showed accountability. Sophie's second apology did not restore trust overnight, but it created a small, honest place where trust might eventually grow. Mom's refusal taught me something equally important, that reconciliation cannot be built by one person alone. I did not win because my parents had to pay $38,000, or because Dad lost the resort contract. Those outcomes belonged to their choices, not to mine. My victory was simpler and quieter than that. I stopped paying for a seat at a table where they welcomed my resources but not me. I did not interrupt the wedding, spread rumors, damage anyone's property, or manipulate a single contract. I followed the agreement exactly as it was written. I told the truth, and I allowed 4 adults to pay for the celebration they had planned and signed for. For years I believed that being a good daughter meant absorbing every cost without complaint. Now I understand that self-respect is not cruelty and saying no is not the same as abandonment. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop rescuing people from the lessons their own behavior has created. Real family is not defined by who shares your last name or who calls when an invoice arrives. It is defined by honesty, by respect, by accountability, and by whether someone still makes room for you when you have nothing to offer except yourself. If you were standing outside the glass pavilion, would you have approved the $38,000 payment, or would you have drawn the same line? Comment the word boundary if you have learned to protect your peace. And if you are still trying to stop carrying everyone else's weight, know that there is no shame in admitting where you are. Recognizing the pattern is the first step toward changing it. And remember, feeling guilty does not mean you are doing something wrong. It means you are doing something new. Thank you for watching this story and sharing this moment with me. If it touched something in you, please like this video and subscribe to True Stories, the Tragedies and Comedies of Life, so that stories like this one can continue to reach the people who need to hear them. Everything in this video is fictional and was created solely for entertainment, dramatic storytelling, and education. True Stories reminds you that when life reveals someone's true intentions, the lesson is not to blame yourself for trusting them. The lesson is to trust yourself enough to walk away.